Well, hey there, guys. Welcome back to part two of my average power performance index, the average for the entire season, where I looked up, and I figured out the averages of each team, where they ranked each week. I totaled them all up and then averaged them together, and then basically took the the average rankings with their overall score and ranked them from number 32 to number 1. Uh, I did in the first part. I did from number 32 to number 17 because I looked at just how much time had gone by and was like, "Well, this takes a little bit," as I kind of thought that it would. So I decided to split it up into two parts and do this part. Now, of course, what I do, and like I say, how I did this, I went and I wrote everything down here that I had on the spreadsheet. I wrote down the total score that they had, what their average was, and then what I do is I go back into the overall spreadsheet here, and I see the lowest that the team finished and the highest that they finished and what particular weeks they finished, and that's kind of where we get their averages. And of course, we have we've gotten this so far. We've got, if you've gone back, if anybody has gone back and watched the first part, you will know who's where. And so let's pick this up with the top two rows here, and finishing at number 16 for the entire season. Number 16. Now, oddly enough, this is a team they finished in the second row, but they did not make the playoffs. Vancouver. So the Vancouver Canucks finished an average of 16th. They had a score of 435. So when I added up all of their totals from their rankings from week 1 to week 26, that was their overall total was 435. They ended up with an average of 16.7. So they ended up with an average of 16.7. Now, if I go back and look here at the spreadsheet and I take a look at where they finished their lowest, their lowest finish and their highest finish. Looking back at their rankings, because they had some in the 20s. It looks like, yeah, because I've done the highest first. So the highest that I see, they had a couple of 9s in there. They had an 8th, and it looks like their highest that they had, they were 8th, and that was in week 3. So I had them 8th in week 3 of the Power Performance Index. The 2 weeks after that, they were 9th, and that was, of course, week 4 and 5. But then I go and I look at what their lowest ranking was, and their lowest ranking was 25th. So in 25th, and that was in week 16. So Vancouver, their highest was 8th, their lowest was 25th, and yeah, they finished, of course, adding up all the scores from their rankings. They had 435, with an average of 16.7, and that makes them number 16 on the average power performance index. Number 15, finishing just ahead of them, which is really kind of shocking that they actually finished this high, because they really had a really disappointing season. But finishing 15th, the New York Rangers. The Rangers finished 15th, which, yes, is still a little bit surprising. But they had a total of 433. So they finished just 2 points ahead of Vancouver. That gave them an average of 16.65. So that ended up being their average there. We go back to the New York Rangers here, and we look at what their highest was. Their highest point was looking like it was, at their highest point, they were third. They were third on the Power Performance Index in Week 3 of the NHL season. They had 1, 2, 3, 4. They had 5 weeks in a row where they were, well, 4 weeks in a row where they were in the top row. The 5th week, which was Week 6, they were 9th. And then the downslide started. They ended up finishing their lowest that they finished. They were 29th. Their lowest was 29th, and that was in Week 13. So, yeah, it just goes to show. And I still need to do the video talking about the New York Rangers and their fall from grace, basically, from last year to this year. But, yeah, in Week 3, they were third in the Power Performance Index. By Week 13, 10 weeks later, 29th. What a drop for them. And I did a video that's on the channel talking about that period of time where they won like 4 of 20. It was just awful. And that's where their slide went. And it just their season just went downhill from there. So the Rangers end up finishing 15th on average. They're with a score of 433, and their average 16.65. Of course, what helps bring that average up was the fact that they had 4 weeks in a row where they were in that top row. They had a 5th, a 3rd, a 5th, and a 6th. So that really kind of helped from weeks 3 to from 3 to 6, or 3 to 7. Yeah, yep, 3 to 6. Yeah, week 3, 4, yep, 3, 4, and 5. So yeah, that's the Rangers. Number 15 ends up being the New York Rangers. Number 14. Now, again, this is another team. They missed the playoffs, but they didn't miss it by much. They end up finishing 14th on average, and that's Calgary. So the Calgary Flames, on average, finished 14th. They ended up with a score of 408. So all total up their rankings for all 26 weeks, 408 was their total. And when you take that and you divide that by the 26 weeks, they end up with an average of 15.7. So, not bad. Definitely not bad. Not quite good enough to make the playoffs, but still. Now, Calgary, we go up to Calgary here on the spreadsheet here, and we go and we take a look at where were they highest. Their highest point. Their highest point. They were third. Was that third? Yep. They were third. And that was in week 2. So they were third on the Power Performance Index in week 2. Now, I fully understand the first couple weeks are always, very sporadic because it's the start of a season. And, most of the teams haven't quite gotten their legs under them. But, I mean, Calgary didn't do that bad for a good chunk of the season. They were right there. I mean, they were in the top 2 rows. They were literally in the top 2 rows all the way up until week 8 of the season. I mean, up until week 8, their lowest, they were 16 in week 4. But I mean, they were, they were 9th in week 7. They were right there. But we go and we look at their lowest point. Their lowest point, okay, they had a 23 there. Yeah, it's looking like that was the lowest. Yep, that was their lowest point. Their lowest point on the PPI. They were 23rd in week 18. So yeah, they were 3rd in week 2, 23 in week 18. They end up 14th on the overall average for the season, a total of 408. Averaged that 408 averaged out by 26 was 15.7, puts them number 14. Number 13. Now this is a playoff team. They weren't looking. When the season started, they weren't looking like a potential playoff team because they got off to a really bad start, but they ended up turning it on when they needed to. They made a couple of trades, and they ended up straightening out their goaltending, and they went from there. Colorado. So the Colorado Avalanche, on the average of the season, finished 13th. They had their total points were 295. So that was their total. That was their total for the season, 295, with an average of 11.35. So even having those really bad first 5 or 6 weeks, they still ended up doing pretty darn well. Now, their highest that they got on the season here, because it's weird. They did not make the top row until week 12. And then they basically were a steady team in the top 2 rows, mainly the top row. So yeah, let's see here. They were their highest that they were all season. Wow. Okay, so the highest they were as high as 3rd. They were as high as third, which oddly enough was week 25. So they were third in week 25. Their lowest point that they had been all year. Got to go all the way back to the beginning here. Their lowest point, they were 30th. And that was in week 2. So yeah, big change there. They started out very slow, but they ended kind of where they needed to be. They had that slow start where, I mean, they were in the low to mid 20s for the first basically month of the season, with week 2 being they were 30th. But by the time it really got into the swing of things, they started being in the top row from about week 12, basically all the way for the rest of the time they were in the top 2 rows. So yeah, Colorado finishes with an average of They finished 13th with a score of 295 and an 11.35 average. They were 30th in week 2, third in week 25. Good turnaround for Colorado. Number 12. Now this is kind of surprising. This one's kind of surprising. It's cool to see that they were here, but especially with the way that they had played the early part of the year. They played fantastic the early part of the year, and then their injuries just started piling up, and they still finished, and they still averaged 12th on the year. Minnesota. So the Minnesota Wild. The Wild end up 12th. Now, can't get much closer to the difference between 12th and 13th. The Wild finished with a total score of 294. So just 1 point ahead of Colorado. An average of 11.31. So the Avalanche had 11.35. The Wild were 11.31. The Wild, the highest they had finished. Now I know that I had not, because it shocked me when I ended up doing this. The highest that they were number 1. I had them first on the Power Performance Index. And that was back-to-back weeks. They were number 1 in back-to-back weeks, in week 8 and week 9. And yeah, they had a heck of a nice little turnaround. They started out kind of slow, but then they started playing real well, and they were in the top row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 weeks in a row, they were in the top row, and it was a heck of a run. And then of course they still kind of flirt with the top couple of rows, and then when the injuries really started getting to them, that's when they really started dropping. The lowest they got on the year. Okay, so the lowest they got they got down to 21st, oddly enough, in week 21. So that was their lowest point. And so, yeah, Minnesota, definitely had their ups and downs, but they still finished 12th on the average, a total of 294 points, or a score of 294, an 11.31 average. They finished first on the index twice, and their lowest point, they were 21st. Only time they were 21, and that was in week 21. So yeah, the Minnesota Wild end up 12th. Number 11 on the total average power performance index. And I mean, it's not totally surprising they were at this point. Again, they kind of had their struggles, but they still did pretty well too. Edmonton. So the Oilers end up 11th. They had a total score. They had a total score of 288 for an average of 11.08. So that was Edmonton's total score and their average. Their highest point, they finished second on 2 occasions. Oddly enough, back-to-back weeks. In weeks They finished second back-to-back weeks in weeks 15 and 16. The lowest that they were, it's looking like it might have been week 1. Yep. Their lowest point, they were 30th. And that was in the very first week. So yeah, they finished 30th their very first week. The first 5 weeks they were in the 20s. They were basically from here to here in this area. But then they started moving up. They ended up in the top row for a few. They had a couple of second place finishes. They had three thirds. Yeah, they had 3 third place, or they were in third 3 times, and yeah, they kind of were up and down. But yeah, overall the Oilers finished with a score of 288, 11.08 average, and good enough for 11th. Finishing 10th in the average PPI, and they had a good season, especially after last year. They definitely needed to have a good season, and that, of course, was New Jersey. So the Devils ended up 10th. They had a score. They had a score of 266. Their average for that one, their average was 10.23. So pretty good, pretty decent season for them. Pretty decent run for them. And of course, we go down here to them. Seeing when, let's see, their highest. Okay, it looks like their highest point that they were second. They were second in week 1. Week 1, Week 7, and Week 12. So yeah, they ended up second 3 times. And if we keep going here, they were second 3 times. Now, the lowest that they finished on the year, they were 14th in Week 3. That was not the lowest that they were. Their lowest point, they were 21st. In Week 20. So yeah, the Devils finished second 3 different times throughout the year, and at their lowest point was Week 20. They were 21st. Still good enough for 10th. And with a score of 266 and an average of 10.23. Good enough for 10th. Finishing 9th. Another good season for these guys. Another very good season. They end up 9th for the total of the season, and that's Tampa. So the Lightning finish just outside the top row. So yeah, Tampa finishes 9th on the season. They end up their score. They finished 1 point ahead of New Jersey. They ended up with a score of 265. Their average, was 10.19. We go back here and we look on my spreadsheet here.